in the webinar are currently listed as attendees. When it's your turn to join a panel for testimony, I will call your name and a member of my staff will promote you to be a panelist. If you wish to activate your video while you testify, you need to click the button in the toolbar at the bottom of your screen that looks like a video camera. Representatives of bona fide organizations will be given 5 minutes to testify. Subsequent representatives from the same organizations will be given 3 minutes to testify. Unaffiliated public witnesses will be given 3 minutes to testify. When your time is up, I ask that you please conclude your remarks so that we can stay on schedule. We will be calling up witness in panels of 4 or 5 witnesses, and council members present will have 7 minutes to ask each panel questions. If you have any technical issues during the hearing, please notify my staff either via the Q&A function in Zoom or by sending an email to facilities@dccouncil.gov. Witnesses are reminded to please send a written copy of their remarks to facilities@dccouncil.gov or upload it to the council's hearing management system so that it may be included in the record. All testimony and pre-hearing documents that have been submitted are available now on the council's hearing management system. The record for this hearing closes in 5 business days at 5 p.m. on Thursday, December 21st. This is a public hearing on B25-0039, the Common Ground Amendment Act of 2023. The stated purpose of Bill 25-0039, the Common Ground Amendment Act, is to require more in-depth analysis prior to the surplus of district land and community engagement in real property surplus and disposition decisions. It would establish an Office of Public Lands Ombudsperson and increase affordable housing requirements and property dispositions for housing development. For decades, development in DC was stalled. No housing was being built, and the district owned a lot of land and buildings that sat vacant and decaying. To attract developers and spur the economy, district leaders decided to use land as an incentive, and it worked. The unprecedented number of construction sites and cranes dotting our skyline are evidence that companies want to invest in our city. The problem is we've been experiencing this growth for quite a while now, but we're still following a decades-old model of surplusing and disposing of our land. We no longer have to beg developers to build here, so why are we still giving away our property so easily? It's time to update the process to ensure we're making the best deals we can so that district residents get the kinds of development they need. This is why I was glad to be a co-introducer of my at-large colleague, Robert White's Common Ground legislation. It requires a long overdue examination of our land management process, increases affordable housing requirements, and ensures the district government will make the best deal it can when disposing of our land. I look forward to hearing input on the community for possible improvements on this legislation. I will say, unfortunately, I have another obligation that will not allow me to stay for the entire hearing, but I will leave the hearing in the most capable hands I know of Councilmember Robert White, who is joining me now today. And so I will recognize Councilmember White for his opening statement, and then we will get started for our first panel of witnesses. Thank you, Councilmember White.
Thank you so much, Chairperson Lewis George. It is an honor to be here today as a member of the Committee on Facilities and Family Services, which you and your dedicated team have been leading with your usual fierce dedication to the needs of district residents. I appreciate you co-introducing my Common Ground bill and convening today's hearing. This bill is about so much more than administrative procedures or technical adjustments. This is about making sure we're doing right by our DC residents and squeezing every bit of good we can out of a precious resource, our public lands. Our law governing land disposition traces back to an act of Congress in 1939. The council has made a ton of changes over the years, mostly for very good reasons, but the law has gotten complicated and clunky. Most of it is contained in a single statutory section, DC Code 10-801, which is well over 5,000 words long. It boils down to a requirement that the mayor has to hold 2 administrative hearings and submit 2 resolutions to the council before she can sell government real estate, lease it out for more than 15 years, or otherwise dispose of it. Before I became chair of the Housing Committee earlier this year, I spent 4 years leading the committee that had jurisdiction over the Department of General Services. In that role, I had the opportunity to take a close look at the mayor's proposed resolutions, declaring that various district-owned parcels were no longer needed for public purposes and could be disposed of to private parties. The council ultimately approved of all of the mayor's proposals, but it was clear that there was a lot of room for improvement. One of the most important provisions of the existing law says that whenever we sell or lease out district land for housing development, the developers have to keep certain percentages of the units affordable for lower income households. My bill would set more ambitious affordability targets. It would also set minimum levels of larger units in these projects. Right now, we know for a fact that some of the families who need affordable housing and can't find it in DC, especially need 3 or more bedrooms. Yet there's no mandate to use our government land to build those larger units. I hope to learn more from the executive about whether my proposed new targets seem feasible. I also think it's important for us all to take a step back and make sure that every deal we commit public land to is actually the best way to serve people. There's no question that we desperately need more housing in DC, and it's not an inherently bad idea to lease out a valuable parcel to a private entity for $1 for 99 years if that entity can deliver deeply affordable housing and some retail. But if that's all we're ever doing with parcel after parcel, regardless of the specific needs of the neighborhood, I start to get concerned that we're not being thoughtful enough. My bill is 33 pages long, and most of that comes from taking the contents of the existing 5,000-word section and restructuring it into something easier for both the public and the administration to understand. But I've also tried to make significant adjustments to make the process more accessible for the public. Looking at transcripts from administrative hearings over the last few years, it's clear that members of the public weren't quite sure what was being asked of them or what their options were. My bill would create the conditions for much more meaningful conversations about the need for public amenities and empower residents to get answers and explain their needs. Thank you again in advance to our public witnesses for being part of this conversation, and thanks again to you and your team, Chairperson Louis George.
Thank you, Councilmember Robert White. I see we have been joined by a committee member and Ward 3 Council Member Matthew Fruman. Councilmember Fruman, do you have an opening statement?
Thank you very much, Ms. George. Thank you, Chairman White. I will be brief. I'm very much looking forward to hearing the testimony at this hearing. This is a very important issue. There's clearly on the table, in a sense, in Chevy Chase, DC right now, where there's a lot of conversation about the library and the rec center. My views on this bill are going to be informed by that process, and I very much welcome the idea of creating a more predictable, more transparent process in this area, and I'm curious to hear what people have to say on that subject and how we can best proceed forward. Very grateful to Chairman White for coming forward with the legislation, and to you, Chairperson Louis George, for holding this hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We will now call our first group of panelists up. Joyce Robinson Paul, Commissioner 5E01. Paula Edwards, Commissioner 4A01. Parisa Neruzzi, Executive Director, Empower DC. Meg McGuire, Chair of the Board of the Northwest Opportunity Partners, CDC. Cheryl Court, Policy Director, Coalition for Smarter Growth. And Nancy Mackwood, Vice Chair of the Committee of 100 on the Federal City. I do not see Joyce and Paula, but I do see Parisa. So good morning, Parisa. You may begin your testimony.
Good morning. Thanks for having this hearing. My name is Parisa Neruzzi. I'm the co-founder and executive director of Empower DC, where for the last 20 years, I've worked with residents from all 8 wards to advance racial, economic, and environmental justice. The use of public land has been a central factor in our work. In fact, I started working in the Ivy City community in 2001 around the fate of the historic Alexander Crummell School. And it was through that process that I started learning about district policies governing public land, such as DC Code 10801 and the Comprehensive Plan. From 2005 to 2010, I led the People's Property Campaign, which was a citywide initiative of residents who were advocating for a change in this system during a time of heightened public land giveaways. And that grassroots effort resulted in the Public Land Surplus Standards Amendment Act, which was passed by the council, however, drastically watered down. It did lead to the requirement of the community hearing that now exists prior to the council receiving a resolution from the mayor seeking to surplus public land. Prior to that, the council was regularly declaring public land surplus without communities ever really knowing at all what was going on. So the community hearing was important just to create a space for residents to start to organize around their views. During this process, we also recognized the additional failure of the city to adequately plan for its facilities needs. And the effort also led to the passage of the District Facilities Plan Amendment Act of 2009, which to my knowledge was never implemented. And so unfortunately today we continue these practices of mostly using public land to foster private development that has contributed to gentrification, that has heightened and worsened racial inequity in the city. The Common Ground Amendment Act attempts to address some of the problems inherent in this system and make some improvements, but I do believe there's areas that the bill could be enhanced. On the plus side, the bill clearly separates out the two functions of declaring land surplus and the separate function of then identifying a disposition method, ensuring that this is no longer happening concurrently, and that each side, each question is given that singular attention that an analysis that it deserves. So that's very important. The bill also clarifies some of the processes involved in terms of supporting public transparency and public input throughout that process, and make sure that the selection of a developer does not happen prior to these steps taking place, which is also very important. The bill creates an ombudsman's office to watchdog the process and provide some support to impacted communities as they engage in the process, and is also supportive in the council in its oversight role. So that is positive. I think there's a number of things that, I've learned through 20 years of working on, 20 plus years of working on the Alexander Crummell School that kind of give me a little bit of a sense of areas where this bill could still be strengthened. We rely so heavily on ANCs in our city to be the conduit through which important notice is given and the word is supposed to get out to community, yet we set no minimum standards of what the ANCs are to do when they receive the notice. And I remember vividly over a decade ago receiving a call from then Councilman Harry Thomas's office saying, oh, the surplus hearing is tonight. Nobody knew about it. Nobody had been notified. The ANC may have received the notice, but they didn't tell anybody. And that was regarding Crummell School. And so I was able to rustle up a few people to attend that. But clearly there has to be some minimum standard of what does an ANC do to engage once they receive notice. I also think that the notice requirements really do need to be strengthened, and we should at least be using the mail to send out postcards in some type of jurisdiction, some type of vicinity around the property, at least as what is practiced in the zoning process. The bill doesn't adequately address the failure of the city to plan for its facilities needs. We still don't have a master facilities plan outside of a couple of distinct agencies. And this is an important reference point for the public to understand this whole question of whether land is surplus. We also need to understand that there's the local needs, but then there's the citywide needs. And the community may not even be aware, for instance, that we need a new archive or that we need a new animal shelter or something like that, if not having this reference tool to look at. I feel very strongly that the bill should specify that the mayor is not to initiate a zoning process for a public land, without having already completed these steps of surplusing and disposition. Currently, this is happening with the 1617 U Street site. The site serves DC Fire and MPD, and even those agencies have not been engaged in a planning effort to determine their facilities needs. DEMPED already held a community meeting moving forward with this assumption that the land is surplus. And the Office of Planning has already initiated a zoning map amendment. I see I'm running out of time. I do have a few other things to add. I am also going to amend my testimony for the record to create a little bit of a timeline of what we've experienced with Cromell School. And I just want to thank you and also just remind that the council is really the most important aspect of this process, because you all are the ones who can say yes or no on surplusing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your testimony. We will have some questions at the end. Meg McGuire. Good morning.
Thank you. I am Meg McGuire, Chair of Northwest Opportunity Partners, CDC. Which is a Ward 3 focused nonprofit organization devoted to racial equity through affordable housing and minority business development in well-planned neighborhoods. We commend this committee for proposing the Common Ground Amendment Act to foster better stewardship of the public lands and to strengthen affordable housing set-asides and requirements for multi-bedroom units. While we have very little public land in Ward 3 to repurpose, we have seen firsthand how badly broken the current surplus and disposition system can be. Nowhere is the cost of this dysfunction more apparent than at the Chevy Chase Community Center, where neighbors are at each other's throats over redevelopment. It is unreasonable to ask communities to turn over the future planning and ownership of public lands to private developers before more deeply engaging themselves. My testimony will focus on an important omission from your bill, ensuring that the tightened procedures also produce substantive planning results before surplus and disposition are on the table and well in advance of a request for proposal. Planning deficit number 1. Even when active public uses are to remain on the site, robust community engagement in planning currently does not take place before the city initiates action to surplus the land and hand it over to a developer. Example, in Chevy Chase, DC Public Library and the Department of Parks and Recreation should have engaged the community before the initial surplus hearing to lay out their full requirements for indoor and outdoor space and to seek ideas from the community about how this responds to user needs. It is our understanding that this dialogue has never been formally held and that many residents are still unclear about the needs and visions of those agencies. A proposed legislative addition. If any current public uses on the site are to remain, at an initial public hearing, the agencies administering these uses must present a detailed statement about their present and future needs and requirements, including expansion or contraction of services or space, and how these uses will be compatible or incompatible with other types of development on the site. The agencies will be responsible for creating an opportunity for neighboring residences and businesses to engage in public discussion and feedback about the ongoing needs and requirements. Planning deficit number 2. City agencies are relying on development jargon that conveys different meanings to different people, but they are doing virtually nothing to foster consensus through a common visual language and understanding of development options, including density. Sticky note planning and static massing diagrams are outmoded tools that limit public understanding and dialogue. Engaging communities in creating various scenarios using ArcGIS City Engine and Urban, which are the gold standard of interactive visual simulation software, is now possible because the Office of Planning has licensed and trained staff in its application. Common Ground can break new ground by creating a preference for this technology in public lands planning. An example, in Chevy Chase, 2 camps have squared off with differing views of the future civic site, with and without an apartment building. There's been no opportunity for residents to participate in visualizing different scenarios of how the site might or might not accommodate a variety of uses, including the library and community center, along with varying amounts of affordable housing. Legislative addition. Using the best interactive simulation technology available, the Office of Planning In collaboration with the Public Lands Ombudsman, will hold an initial public meeting to model development options and their visual impact on the surrounding neighborhood. Development options may include continuing public uses on the land, new public uses such as affordable housing, education facilities, and open space, and private development. Both the simulations and the community responses will become part of the record and made available to the council for consideration in its final decision on surplus and disposition of the site. We believe that diversity and equity can be achieved only when communities are meaningfully engaged in planning for change. Correcting these planning deficiencies through legislation can provide a far better future outcome for our beloved city. Thank you for this opportunity to testify.
Thank you so much for your testimony. Please stay on. We'll have questions at the end of this panel. Next, we have Cheryl Court. Good morning, Cheryl.
Good morning, Chair Louis George and Councilmember White and Councilmember Furman. My name is Cheryl Court. I'm with a nonprofit called Coalition for Smarter Growth. We are the leading organization advocating for walkable, bikeable, inclusive, transit-oriented communities as the most sustainable and equitable way for the Washington, D.C. region to grow and provide opportunities for all. We appreciate the framework of this bill, which sets out how D.C. can examine it decides how to use its public properties. And we recommend that we also more explicitly include air rights as a part of this this process, and how those air rights or just surplus properties end up furthering district goals. We definitely agree that we need more transparency in this process. And we also hope that through this legislation, we can commit to the priorities that we've set out in the existing law for affordable housing requirements in public land dispositions, and ensure that affordable housing remains a top priority in these considerations as we look at opportunities to leverage resources to create permanently affordable housing. We have actually worked on this issue for many years, published a paper a long time ago about this, and subsequently worked to increase the affordability requirements, set-asides to a more aggressive 30% set-aside near transit and 20% not near transit at deeper affordability levels. And we want to continue to support that. We would note that talking with affordable housing developers, that what I think we sort of agreed to as a policy goal is that we would use public land to leverage the value of that public land in order to cross-subsidize affordable housing. Actually, my backdrop is 965 Florida Avenue, which is where the new Whole Foods is. It's right by the U Street Metro Station. It's now called the Wren. This is a great example of a public land disposition. It has no outside subsidy. All of the value to subsidize more than 100 units of deeply affordable housing for households earning 30 and 50% median family income came out of the value of the land. And we think that that principle of leveraging that value, all the value of the land down to zero, is more important today maybe than it was even a few years ago, given the crisis we have in the freezing of low-income housing tax credits, and future budget challenges, that we really want to make sure that we leverage the value of the land to achieve these affordable housing goals. And so we'd recommend not actually changing the 30% set aside, because we think that's really the limit of not having to be forced to seek outside subsidy dollars. While some public land decisions do need or seek outside subsidy dollars, the legislation, the law is structured so that we need to actually fully utilize the value of the land first before we look at outside subsidies. And so 965 Florida Avenue is an example of a high value site that was able to subsidize 99 units at 50% median family income and 33 at 30% median family income with no outside subsidy. So we'd like to retain that policy structure. There's a lot of debate about, a few years ago, we used to do a combined public land disposition and development agreement process, and then we separated it. So then I go to a Chevy Chase, a follow-up to the Chevy Chase Small Area Plan to talk about the library site, where we're looking at air rights for replacing a library community center and adding affordable housing. And people are like, why don't we have detailed plans about what you're trying to do? We want more information. So I'm not sure. I know that this legislation tries to further separate the consideration of surplusing from development agreement. I'm not sure if that works based on the experience that we've had. I will provide more detailed comments. One more thing on community benefits agreements. I think that community benefits agreements could potentially erode the commitment that we've made to deeply affordable, a large set aside of 30% at deeply affordable levels. And I would like, I think that affordable housing should remain our top priority. And the uncertainty of a negotiated process is better put into law, basically, as a citywide goal of affordable housing. And one last thing, the changing from the HUD definitions for affordable, like extremely low income versus very low income would be confusing. We might want to look at how to make sure that we can keep track of definitions of the different income levels. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Please stay on. We will have questions at the end of this panel. Nancy Mackwood, I saw you on and then I saw you drop off. Just want to not sure if it was a technical issue or not. So just want to check and see if she's going to come back on at any time. Oh, she's back. Great. That's what I thought would happen. Welcome back. Good morning, Nancy. Nancy, if you are on, you can unmute and begin your testimony.
All right, thank you. Good morning.
Good morning.
I am Nancy McWood. I'm testifying for the Committee of 100 on the Federal City. We have a keen interest in Bill 2539 introduced by Councilmember Robert White, in part because we worked to reform public land surplus and disposition procedures almost 2 decades ago. Though the current legislation adds important processes to provide more transparency and safeguard citizens' interests, we urge the Council to strengthen some of the bill's provisions. In our view, the major problem with surplus and disposition of public land is that the administration has the beginning, the middle, and the end of the process scripted from the outset. There is no authentic separation of the surplus and disposition procedures. The required community hearings are a sham because there is no intention to revise either the surplus decision or the disposition based on community views and needs. When the bill was introduced, Councilmember White issued a thoughtful public statement that declared one of his goals was to increase community input to elevate community needs above developers' desires. To achieve that goal, we urge the Council to add 3 provisions. 1, the Council Office of Racial Equity Corps should issue a report on the surplus resolution as prepared by the Office of Planning and the disposition resolution when it is sent to the Council. While the bill provides for a report from the administration's Chief Equity Office, that office cannot be expected to analyze the pros and cons of changing the status of public land in a specific location as independently, thoroughly, or as frankly as CORE. CORE has demonstrated its capacity for quick, professional, and relevant insights regarding racial equity that are particularly useful in the legislative process. 2, the Council should issue guidance to the mayor and the administration on appropriate optional methods of disposition when it approves a surplus resolution. It's clear that the Council must take a more active role in protecting public land and using it for productive public purposes and/or key non-public uses. The surplus and disposition processes provide an opportunity for the Council to be involved. The council should demonstrate that it will listen to the comments of each community, hoping to influence a surplus decision and shape a disposition plan. No longer should a mayor administration give away public land for purposes that may have little to do with the community's interests or needs and everything to do with enriching developers. The only way to assure the public that its wishes will be heard is for the council to critically evaluate the efficacy of agreeing to surplus, and importantly, to frame what disposition options should be considered before the mayor takes that planning step. This will also serve to heighten the relevance of the surplus process as an instructive step in determining how best to use our limited public land. 3, encouragement of a community benefit package negotiated by the ANC should become a requirement with no triggering conditions. Communities often disagree vehemently with surplus proposals for a variety of reasons. One way to mitigate whatever harm or loss communities identify is to require public land acquirers to incorporate specific community needs as mandatory elements of their future stewardship of the land. We also urge the council to consider revising the half-mile analysis to include similar data collection for the relevant comprehensive plan area element. A half-mile picture may not accurately represent the level of affordable housing, including units in the pipeline or under construction, the area's need now and in the future for public uses, or the demographics even a mile from a public land site. The council should not limit the scope of relevant information it receives when assessing the future of public land. In addition, Committee 100 finds that the affordable housing waiver in the bill is largely carried over from the current law. The need for affordable housing has changed since current law was passed. Increasing the affordable housing percentage set aside must be an important step in the disposition process, as well as requiring multiple bedroom units to meet the needs of DC families. In recognition of the urgent need for maintaining affordable housing, including naturally occurring affordable housing, and creating new affordable housing, we urge the council to remove language that allows the administration and developers to escape a firm affordable housing commitment. Let's make what we want what we get. Similarly, other waiver pathways should be tightened and made hard to testify. I see that my time has expired and the testimony was almost complete. So I will thank you for your time, and I will submit the balance of my statement.
Thank you so much for your testimony and for being here as well. We are going to get started with questions for our witnesses of this panel. Parise, I wanted to start with you. I think you made some really great points on creating standards both for ANC commissioners and standards for outreach. Could you elaborate on what that would look like, what you believe that should look like as we create such parameters?
Yeah, and this is something we've been thinking about because, obviously it's an urgent need across many district programs, and both in terms of this aspiration that we have as a city to become more racially equitable, which requires meaningful public engagement, meaningful community engagement, and yet we fail as a city to really define what that means and to do anything to set some standards or put resources behind it. I think it could be the subject of another piece of legislation that could create even a workforce element for helping to advance community engagement throughout the city. I think at the very least, however, if we are counting on ANCs to be the primary conduit through which an important issue like this is to be disseminated to the community, that we must require that they have some forms of distribution, whether, ideally, right now things are so disparate, right, across ANCs. Some have a newsletter, some put out leaflets, some only use email, some don't do anything. So I think we really do need to have a conversation about setting some minimum standards and, yes, providing the resources necessary. And I think we're in a tough position because we have relied so much on volunteer labor, which is really inequitable at its heart. And so we, we're seeing the result of that. This is extreme disparity that exists across the city in terms of how active certain ANCs are. So I would ask that we, create space to have a deeper conversation about that. You may already know that the Office of Racial Equity released a meaningful community engagement guide. There's all this talk, but very little action about, what does this really mean? And it's an art and a science, right? So it has to do with both using multiple methods, having actual distribution on the ground, but also knowing people, knowing the community, knowing the types of organizations, going through churches and tenant associations and PTAs and not just, the usual suspects.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the reminder about the facilities plan legislation that is being ignored. My committee will be reviewing that legislation and seeing what we can do through oversight and updated legislation to correct that. Ms. Court, I want to come to you. Your example of 965 Florida Avenue is a great example of what the district can do through disposition. But it's not the norm, right? So very few of our dispositions have gotten nearly that level of affordability. How do we get more of that without changing the legislation?
I don't know that it is out of the norm. I think it's other places don't have the value, and so they've had to add subsidy in order to get to that 30% set aside. But I guess so, I mean, I guess I'm not aware that the dispositions aren't doing the 20 or 30% set aside at those income levels.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that level of affordability, I mean, I think it's a great example. Would love to see more of that. It just feels like very few of our dispositions have gotten that amount, that level of affordability over through subsidy across the board. Ms. McGuire and Ms. Mackwood, we agree that community input is critical to this process. We need to hear from more residents, not less. The other side of that, however, is that community input can also lead to less affordable housing and less development in general. How do we balance that input when the needs of the district as a whole?
Okay, I will chime in on that. I think that the emphasis on affordable housing is absolutely critical. And what you don't want to find is that affordable housing gets pitted against other values. And that's the value of visual simulation, is that you can show people how different uses can be accommodated. I've been part of planning processes where visual simulation was used to great effect. It managed to de-escalate the sense that any development was going to somehow damage the whole character of the neighborhood. And so there's got to be some way that people are brought together to develop a common visual language. And that is what visual simulation has repeatedly done. I am going to try to submit for the record a video that was part of the Committee of 100 conversations developed by the makers of ArcGIS, and so that people can become informed about the tremendous power of this technology. And it's only going to become increasing with AI applications within that. We're crazy not to be using it.
Yeah.
Council member, I would say that community engagement is not in conflict with achieving citywide goals, and particularly with achieving affordable housing. I think that the Chevy Chase example is instructive as to how the process may frustrate the support for affordable housing. In that case, you've got two continuing public uses, but there is no information that's been provided to the community, as far as I know, as to what the needs of those continuing needs of those public uses are. How much square footage is necessary to continue those uses based on the community's needs? How much additional density is available for either other public uses or non-public uses? I think when we aren't clear and transparent, particularly regarding continuing public uses, that sets up a really unproductive and unnecessary dynamic where the community is sort of pitted as not supporting affordable housing, when indeed they do support affordable housing, but their concern is that they want more information about the public uses so they understand what the additional density could be used for. I would hate to leave the impression that with the council, that there is some inherent conflict between achieving citywide goals and public engagement. I think it's quite the contrary based on my experience.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to my colleague, Councilmember Robert White.
Thank you, Chairperson Louis George, and thank you very much to these public witnesses. A couple of particularly interesting perspectives on this panel, given the Cromell School and the long and difficult history there, and something else that's happening right now, which is the redevelopment of the Chevy Chase Community Center. Let me start with Parisa Nuruzzi. One of the things that you mentioned was that the bill doesn't address the lack of a master facilities plan, which you're right about. But what would a master facilities plan look like, a sufficient one? What would that look like to you?
I think that the legislation that I linked to, which was passed in 2009, does a fairly good job outlining the types of things. But it has to do with, really identifying the facilities needs of district agencies in order to have full and equitable access to the programs and services they provide across the district, and to ensure that we have the, adequate types of facilities for the multiple needs of the district itself. And I think that that definition is growing to include environmental concerns, right? So perhaps we do need to identify places for solar arrays, or we do need to identify places for heat mitigation and carbon, neutrality goals. Like, we have all these goals as a city, and those goals should not be just looked at as things that we rely on the private market for, right? But that we first utilize our own public resources for. And I would hope that we would start to really look both at the facilities needs of the district government agencies itself and the nonprofit organizations that are part of this ecosystem that help to provide for the material needs of district residents. So if we're pricing out the groups that, do the day-to-day services, if it's food, if it's youth programming, et cetera, that is also a big problem for the city. So I think that should be part of the analysis.
So one of the frustrations that led my team and I to develop this bill was there would be, empty parcels or vacant buildings that were causing a lot of problems in communities. It would sit there year after year after year. Then DMPED would come to the community with a development partner and say, hey, we've cooked up this great plan. Do you like this plan, or do you like what you have now? And sort of, something is usually better than nothing. And so folks, it seemed, felt forced to pick this other use. What I'm trying to do is put more power and authority in our communities to talk about the things that they need in their community. But you bring up a really good point, and I think another witness did as well. There are some citywide needs, like you mentioned archives or an animal shelter. So do you have thoughts on how we would balance giving communities more say in the types of things built in their community, and or balance that with making sure that we are finding places for citywide needs like animal shelter, homeless shelters, archives, things like that. Parisa, if you have thoughts on that.
I'm so sorry. My internet dropped and I just joined back, so I missed your question.
So you raise an important point in your testimony about the fact that we have citywide needs. So my bill is trying to put more authority with our communities so that they have more say so in what goes in their communities instead of having developments drop down on them. But there are citywide needs that won't be top of mind to them frequently, like animal shelters, homeless shelters, the archives. Do you have thoughts on how we balance giving more power to communities to say the types of things that they want to see in their community and that they need? How do we balance that with the citywide needs and the fact that we as a city need to have places for those things?
I think that we definitely need to look at co-location. It's something that, there's a discussion of, but we haven't really been thoughtful about it. And right now we're mostly talking co-location with a private market-driven thing, like a private housing with a public use. But I think co-location of multiple types of public uses would allow there to be a mixture of addressing the citywide need as well as incorporating and making it a positive amenity for the immediate community as well. So that would be my primary response to that. But I think we also need to educate the public about some of these citywide needs, right? And I do think that there becomes a time where the city has to, for instance, with the location of the family shelters or halfway houses, the city has to do an analysis of what is the equitable distribution of these types of programs that we need to have as a city. And yes, some neighborhoods and some neighbors may be upset at certain times, but seek to be fair in the distribution. And I think that will help, alleviate some of the concerns.
Thank you. Meg McGuire. So this bill has an interesting possible application in Ward 3, which is, in wards 5, 7, 8, most other wards, there's a need for more housing that everyday people can afford. There's some parts of our city that need more market rate housing because we have put so much quote unquote affordable housing, low income housing in those neighborhoods, and have concentrated it. But in Ward 3, when we're looking at the future redevelopment of Chevy Chase, there are some people who say, hey, as a city, we need more affordable housing, and this is government-owned property. We should be putting it there. But there are some other neighbors in that community who are saying, yeah, we believe we need more affordable housing, just not here. And so this bill could have a different impact in a place like Chevy Chase. What's your thought on how we can balance making sure that we are building for the citywide needs and building affordable housing where we need it, without sort of allowing people to veto those citywide needs because they don't want to see them in a particular community?
Well, that's why I think it's so important to show people that there are different ways of achieving different objectives on the same site. I also think that, and Northwest Opportunity Partners has been promoting for the last year an affordable housing land acquisition fund. Let's say that fund was in place and funded. Now, potentially, you could buy the Wells Fargo site, and now you're talking about a wholly different project. But we don't have that supplementary tool of being able to buy commercial properties for affordable housing. And I can tell you that in Ward 3, it's going to be really difficult to have new affordable housing unless and until we have some capability of buying these commercial properties that may come up for sale or that may need to be repurposed for affordable housing. So there's a variety of tools that are needed, but I do believe that at Chevy Chase, had they started out with a robust use of what can go on this site, how can it be designed in a way to accommodate different scenarios, that the conversation could have been markedly different.
Last question. I'm over time and I apologize. Quick question. I just want to clarify for Cheryl Court, 965 Florida Avenue. There's no ongoing subsidy for this building.
Right, and that would be the case for some other land acquisitions as well. That's really the intention. That was originally how it was really conceived. And so 965 is a great example of leveraging the high value of the site to subsidize deeply affordable housing.
Wow. Okay, I appreciate it. I think we might need to study that project more because we are usually told that it is not possible to build without ongoing subsidy. So I will want to understand the financing for that building better. Now, thank you very much. And Nancy McWood, as always, thank you so much for your thoughtful testimony on this bill. I'm 2 minutes over time, so I'm going to wrap there. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you. Councilmember Fruman is still here. Councilman Fruman, do you have any questions for this panel?
Yeah, thank you very much, Chairperson Lewis George. One thing that has come up in the Chevy Chase Civic Corps setting is the RFP process, and I guess I'd be curious to hear from a couple of people, but Ms. McWood, I'm curious to what extent you see using an RFP process as a way of getting input. So, I mean, right now we talk about surplusing, and then we talk about disposition, but between that is an RFP process where presumably an RFP could be shaped to reflect community values. How do you see that process fitting in the context of this legislation?
I think the RFP process should reflect what the community has identified as their needs and concerns during the surplus process. One of the things I mentioned in our testimony, in Committee 100 testimony, is that we've been very concerned about the lack of distinction between the surplus process and the disposition process. It's all kind of all tied together, and you don't really see that the surplus process is having an effect on the disposition process, and specifically what you're talking about, the RFP process. So what I think just looking at RFP as a process without looking at how meaningful that process is not going to get you a different result. So what I would suggest is that the council be more involved in making suggestions to the administration after surplusing as to what would be appropriate dispositions for the property. And those suggestions could be based on both the citywide needs that have been discussed this morning, as well as the area needs and the community needs, all of which are represented, I would note, in the comprehensive plan. It's not like we've got to reinvent anything. We've got a lot of documentation about what the needs are, but that RFP ought to represent what has been said during the surplus process. So it can be a very meaningful step in the process, but it needs to respond to what happened and what was said during the surplus.
Okay, thank you. Are there others on the panel who would want to comment about the RFP process? How an RFP process fits into this landscape? Because it does strike me that the RFP process is a very important piece of this puzzle, but is there anybody who wants to chime in?
Councilmember Freeman, I'll just note that what's helpful about the process that we've had for the library site is that it started with a comprehensive or a small area plan. So there was a community process that put together kind of that broader context that identified the civic core as having a specific role, that was actually a particularly important affordable housing opportunity site, because it was public land that you basically have air rights to support affordable housing, along with renewing the public facilities there. So that is a particularly good context for moving forward in creating a framework around obviously some more additional specific input from the public in order to put that into an RFP, and then be able to have public input on the backside of actually looking at, putting all these pieces together. How could you come up with some feasible scenarios and comparing those and figuring out which one is the best one?
I see Ms. Maruzi's hand is up.
Yeah, thank you. Just in the Carmel School process, we went through the RRFP. We actually formed a team with community members and submitted a proposal. I will say that the process feels extremely politically motivated. There seems to be a lot of closed door negotiation that happens with the favored parties. For instance, in that case, we had a very strong proposal with partners like City First Enterprises and Habitat for Humanity and William C. Smith and others. And we never got the opportunity to go back and forth or have any kind of discussion of our proposal. However, the politically favored developer who the mayor ultimately selected, and of course, down the road, you all know the end of the story, that we overcame all of that. But they were given that opportunity, and the RFP did not adequately reflect the amount of public space, the amount of public use that had long been cried out for in the community. So the plan that the mayor selected gave, a postage stamp of public space. And so then at the end of the day, we had to, work to encourage the council not to approve it, which is what happened. The other thing I'll mention is once we have the RFP now for Carmel School, again, there's like a little politically motivated element in the RFP now for adding pickleball to the site, which is, again, not something that came from the community, but it's a fad, and the mayor has an interest in adding these things. So we have to figure out how to temper that political motivation.
All right, thank you very much. I see Meg McGuire's hand is up, and then I suspect my time will be up.
Yes, to the degree that our RFP process really reflects some real planning, then fine. But we've heard that in this case, there was a lot of sort of sticky note planning and summary judgments. That's what we see with so much planning in the city, is that you're asked to kind of put your dots and your sticky notes with your little tiny comments, but there's no public forum for real discussion. And I realize the difficulty of those public forums, but I think you can structure them in such a way that they're moderated toughly, and that there is real substance that comes out of them. It is not going to be credible to have an RFP process without public discussion and without votes on real choices that can be made. And we're not doing a good job on that score citywide, and it's coming to roost, I think, in the RFP process in Chevy Chase. So I want to see meaningful choices.
So I'm over time, but I mean, I actually am not sure that you can have a discussion about real choices until you see tangible proposals. And I think that's when the real discussion happens. And so you have discussions about abstractions, but I do think that the RFP process should be, and I hear you, Ms. Naruzzi, that it isn't always, but that it should be an important process, but that ultimately, and maybe it's similar to what you're saying, Ms. McGuire, that you need to see it more and see different alternatives. Ultimately, the real discussion happens when there's real proposals. But for now, I'm well over time, and so I will step back and thank you to all of the folks who have testified.
You're all good. You're in the thick of this disposition thing, so I figure I give you a few more minutes, Matt. to be able to really get to some questions. I was also just thinking as we were asking questions into the greater conversation of when we dispose of land and thinking of local needs, like Parisa's talking about having a facilities plan. I just think about right now we're in a crisis with swing space in the city, where we have these modernizations, but we don't have places for certain wards to swing to school. I think about Ward 8, where we dispose of land there, and now their swing space is about 7 miles away from their community when they're going to go through modernizations. Ward 6, Ward 7, right now we don't have swing spaces for them in their ward. So having a long-term plan and thinking about all of the city needs really does have to be a conversation, especially as we see growth as well. And I think in our ward, we have overcrowding at Lafayette and other schools. We just had to deal with overcrowding at Roosevelt, which we were able to solve. But as we think about future needs of lands, thinking about our education sector, our schools, and the growth that we have there is also has to be a part of the conversation. When we think about a facilities plan that encompasses all of our future population needs and our current population needs and where we are. So thank you to this entire panel of witnesses. This has been a very healthy conversation. We're going to go to our next and final panel of witnesses. Going to call them, and I think there's only 2 here right now, but I'll call everyone and see who ends up coming. We have Margaret Linsner, Ward 3 Housing Justice. Nicholas Del Don, Wardman Hotel Strategy Team, Debbie Steiner, Public Witness, Christopher Williams, Public Witness, Andrea Rosen, Public Witness, and Kush Karad, Public Witnesses. A reminder, if you are a witness, just raise your hand so we can promote you. If we do not see you, we will promote you. Okay. All right. I don't see Margaret, so we're going to start. Nicholas Del Don, Wardman Hotel Strategy Team. Good afternoon. Nicholas, you can begin your testimony. You can unmute and begin.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. My name is Nick Deladon. I'm the president of DuPont East Civic Action Association. I am also a founding member of the Wardman Hotel Strategy Team, which has worked for 3 years for affordable housing. We tried to get the city to purchase the property, and we continue to work for more affordable housing at the site. Wardman has become famous as a missed opportunity in the city to reach the mayor's goal of affordable housing. We applaud the purposes of this bill, but remain concerned that it does not address the problems. Our concern is that the city sells public land to developers cheaply in the expectation of affordable housing, and we get instead a glut of luxury housing while we need affordable housing to reach as we have reached a crisis. 2 prime examples are the Chevy Chase property and the police and fire station complex at 1617 U Street, one of the last public parcels remaining in the city. In the latter case, DEMPED has held public meetings where virtually all of the public comment was to oppose the sale of the property. Their voice is being ignored as the process proceeds, and we're following that carefully. But it is a prime example of what this bill should be trying to address, is that the city doesn't really listen to the complaints, and they proceed as if by direction from some other source. We agree that it is a scandal that the sale of scarce, precious public resources has become a city policy. and it is not clear that the bill addresses the problems and fear that it may, in fact, become institutionalized with the bill. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you. Margaret Linzer, Ward 3 Housing Justice. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. My name is Margaret Lenzner. I'm a lifelong resident of Northwest Washington. I've been involved with Ward 3 Housing Justice for 3 years, beginning with efforts to persuade the city to acquire the Wardman Hotel property for substantial affordable housing in Ward 3. We were disappointed when that effort failed. The 16-acre Wardman property is now being developed with 900 luxury apartments with only 8% affordable units. Ward 3 Housing Justice does not support B25-0039 as drafted because it misses some critical requirements. While we are encouraged by its provisions to expand analysis and community input before the city can surplus and dispose of DC property, some critical steps are missing. At the beginning of planning for city-owned land, specificity about public uses and whether surplus of the property is contemplated must be made clear. This was not done when planning for the Chevy Chase Civic Core began. The continuing controversy over development of that property demonstrates the vital importance of initial transparency if a project is to be successful with community support. After years of planning and completion of the SAP, DEMPED's notice that surplus is part of the city's plan was a surprise that shocked the Chevy Chase community. It fueled distrust in DEMPED, OP, and the mayor, and it threatened the community's goals for high-level renovation of the library and community center. As advocates for affordable housing, we are aware that community distrust jeopardizes additional uses such as housing. Surplus was announced before DCPL and DPR defined and disclosed their needs and vision for the public facilities. The community should have the opportunity to evaluate the agency's detailed plans before surplus and disposition are considered. This bill fails to require sufficient timely transparency about the planners and agency's intentions. Another deficiency is the failure to require community input in requests for proposals, RFPs, or competitive sealed bids. RFP and disposition through a negotiated sale are barely mentioned. On page 16, it says only that evaluation shall include economic factors. Despite requirements for community involvement during the analysis process, the public is not informed about the RFP or negotiation with developers. The details of a proposed disposition are critical. It is very important that the community have full information and the opportunity to advise before the disposition is finalized. Ward 3 Housing Justice has not taken a position on the Chevy Chase Civic Core issues. We are committed to advancing affordable housing and greater socioeconomic diversity in Ward 3 with strong community support. Our recent focus has been on Friendship Heights. As Council Member Fruman said on October 27th, redevelopment of the WMATA properties there present, quote, by far the largest opportunities in Ward 3 for affordable housing. Thank you for this opportunity to testify about B25-0039 with suggestions for critical improvements.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I do not see Debbie Steiner or Christopher Williams. Andrea Rosen.
Hi, my name is Andrea Rosen. I'm a Ward 4 Chevy Chase resident. Thank you for this bill, which provides a framework for making the surplus and disposition processes data-driven and accountable. I hoped that the Common Ground Act would address what I see as the central weakness of the surplus and disposition law, which is that it allows the city to conduct one-sided top-down engagement and to carry on impervious to community feedback. But this bill places no obligation on the mayor or council to integrate in the plans for a surplus site what they have heard from residents of the affected community. Why hold at least one public surplus hearing to obtain community input at an accessible time and place nearby, only to proceed as if no interaction had taken place? I am now a veteran of a public surplus hearing in my community for the divestment of some part of the 1.68 acre public space on Connecticut Avenue, just south of Chevy Chase Circle. Residents were told to ignore the meaning of the law's language, quote, no longer required for public purposes, but to see surplusing as simply prerequisite to adding a new use, a privately owned apartment building with dedicated affordable units, number and sizes to be determined. Please don't change those words, though, rather respect them. The majority who spoke at the Chevy Chase Public Surplus meeting opposed surplusing, arguing that the site is actively, fully used for public purposes, and that there are others queued up should space be found, such as a senior center, which Ward 3 does not have. Some speakers advocated for retaining the site for social housing under a future Green New Deal. DEMP had accepted written comments for a month after the hearing, which allowed a deluge of emails in support of surplusing to enter the record. Most of these largely form letters were generated by advocacy groups and were sent by writers elsewhere in DC and in Maryland. DEMP weights these comments on par with those heard at the public surplus hearing near the site, a procedure that undermines the purpose of the statute to hear from the community. Unsurprisingly, the Chevy Chase Commons is on track for surplusing, and a new zone has already been set down by the Zoning Commission. If 10801 is to have legitimacy, authentic communication must go in both directions, and decision-making must be demonstratively responsive to community input. Community-led redevelopment should be the goal in a democratic society. I have some specific concerns. Under Section 101 definitions, libraries must be added to the list of key public amenities. Under Section 104, initial surplus analysis, rent-stabilized housing and tenant-based housing voucher distribution should be part of the analysis if the council wants a true picture of affordable housing near the proposed surplus site. And finally, the bill needs to, this is not finally, the bill needs to explicate standards for balancing competing key public amenities, such as housing and everything else, when they are in conflict. And finally, the law and this bill are silent on any obligation of the government to preserve, let alone increase, access to green space that is lost to surplusing and redevelopment. Thank you for your consideration of my remarks.
Thank you, Ms. Rosen. Next up, we will have Kush Karad.
Yes. Good afternoon, High Council members. My name is Kush Karad, and I am testifying in support of the vision of the Common Ground Act of 2023. I have lived in this area my entire life, bouncing around until my family found an affordable home for me and my sister. Housing affordability has been ever present in my family's life as we grew up in Montgomery Village in Maryland, going to school in College Park, having a few stints in DC, to living here now. And my rent has only held more space in my mind and my budget. And this isn't only the case for me, but tens of thousands of DC residents every day. As an organizer, I've worked with countless neighbors to help them through their rental assistance applications, navigating conversations between them and their landlords, to finding them an emergency place between them and their children to live. Just this morning, I attended a landlord-tenant court hearing where a resident for the first time since 2005 is set to be evicted and displaced fees a few $100s while he's dealing with the loss of a family member and a job. This is not care, and this should not be our everyday. A crisis requires bold and creative solutions. Seeing how the executive can afford a $500 million arena while slashing social services, it is crucial for the government to face this head on and provide the necessary resources to protect our most vulnerable. I believe the Common Ground Act is that step in the right direction. Public land acquisition is crucial for us to address our affordability crisis. When I close my eyes and think about what this could look like, I see deeply affordable units, I see schools, I see libraries, healthcare centers, and maybe even a social housing complex, all of which has been denied for Black and Brown DC residents in the past. By centering the needs of our residents rather than leaning on the private market, community members are able to come together, advocate for their priorities, and actualize their dreams. This is an opportunity for the DC government to right wrongs of the past. As I dig deeper in the bill, I have some thoughts based on my experience to make sure that this bill has all the specifics to be helpful. Because without being mindful of details, we face continuing harm, as my fellow advocates have made. For one, as much as we should strive to be community informed, we should also be data informed in that process. By providing data and resources to community members to guide their discussion with full transparency and protection, we give them all the tools needed to make their community a better place. This seems crucial to prevent outside influence and pressure. So I hope we could add that into this. Two, I wonder if there could be an emphasis on affordability measures, such as AMI levels, rent stabilization, and voucher for potential housing to ensure that we are addressing our housing needs and not letting a select few yell over others to restrict housing opportunity. Three, there is a clear and obvious connection between this bill and the Green New Deal for housing. I hope they could work in tandem to address housing needs as part of larger community needs. Lastly, I hope we could work in partnership with organizations already out here doing this work. There are several DC organizations that do that in Montgomery County. There's an organization called Everyday Canvassing, which I'm a board member, which is focused on facilitating these exact type of conversations between government and residents for planning major master plans as well as policy and budget engagement. So people are already doing the work, we just have to bring them in. I'm really grateful that we're working on such legislation as our home faces these daunting challenges. But just like this legislation says, we fix this when we learn and work together. I look forward to working with you all and continue creating a DC where families can live and thrive in peace.
Thank you so much for your testimony. I'm going to check in with my team to see if any of the panelists that we're missing are present. I'm getting a nod, no. Thank you to this this panel of witnesses. I do not have any questions at this time. I have to head out to attend to a Ward 4 matter. I am handing over the hearing to my colleague, Councilmember Robert White, who will take it over and may have some questions for this panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you again, Chairperson Louis George, and thank you to this panel of witnesses. Just a couple of questions. I really appreciate the thoughtful feedback from these and previous panelists. Andrea Rosen, you mentioned that one weakness you see of the bill is that it still allows for one-sided negotiations. What would better negotiations look like in your view?
Well, you know, I feel like a sort of social pariah, but I guess I would turn it back to you and say, or to anybody who's worked on this legislation, what do you expect to come from a public hearing in the community? Sorry, I know that's probably not allowed. I guess when I was new to this process, which was like 10 years ago, I was really stunned to learn that a community came together and said no to the surplusing, like the majority, and it had zero effect. The plan just proceeded. So I guess I would say, if, for example, the planning arm of the government heard strongly expressed from a community at this public surplus meeting that they didn't want a surplus to happen at all, I would sort of look at the various threads. Well, okay, some people don't want it to happen because they support social housing. Other people don't want it to happen because they're concerned that they'll lose green space and outdoor recreation space. And then from there, you'd have to go to a sort of like maybe a space planning phase where you would see whether all of those things could be integrated with housing. And if so, how much housing? So in other words, instead of just being implacable and impervious, which is what the government is, you would have to sort of hear what you're, take in what you're hearing and see, as you would in a small social group in your family or whatever, how can we reconcile these things? And maybe, just maybe, as happened at 5 libraries and the Cromell School, where housing was proposed to be a private use in a public space, that was reversed. There was no housing at Southwest Library, at MLK, at Tenley Town, at there's one more and I'm forgetting it, actually 2 more. Anyway, I'm forgetting, but it's in my testimony, I think, maybe.
Well, I do understand your point. I guess that what I struggle with, and I welcome now or later any thoughts that you have. You can only legislate what you can legislate, and we can't legislate everything. So I wouldn't put forward legislation that says if the majority of people who come to a meeting say X, then you have to do X, because that could be a small but vocal minority, and we could set up a situation where there would never be approvals for like homeless shelters or many other citywide needs. I also recognize another major limitation with legislation, which is that the mayor could always ask, as happens frequently with dispositions, the council to waive certain requirements, and then they get waived. So I agree with you that what we lay out in the bill isn't perfect. But what I am trying my best to do to the fullest extent possible is to give more voice and more strength to the voice of communities. By bringing the community in earlier, I think we give more strength, because again, once a community is told, hey, here's the idea that we've developed for your community, and they're trying to decide between this idea that's already fully baked and the vacant building that's been sitting there for years, they're going to pick that fully baked idea. But there are limitations to what we can do legislatively. So I do take your concern. I just don't know that I have an answer to it at this time. I wonder if others on the panel have thoughts on this same question. Is there a way legislatively that we could give more strength to communities without giving so much strength that communities could veto citywide needs? That is open to anyone who has thoughts.
This is Margaret Lenzner. I don't know how to do it legislatively, but I think that to the extent that the Chevy Chase situation is an example, discussions there between OP, I guess, and the ANC began probably 5 years ago. And I think I always suspected that the city had in mind what it wanted to do there. And the ANC agreed that affordable housing was a good idea. So they launched the small area plan process, but that was for more than just the civic core. And to some extent, I think a lot of community engagement, people didn't take advantage of the opportunities. I don't think they had any idea what was really contemplated. So as the process moved forward towards surplus all of a sudden out of the blue, the people were shocked. But as Meg McGuire pointed out, nobody knows really what the city's talking about. It's just so vague. So I don't know how legislatively you can correct that discrepancy between perhaps what the city really does have in mind, but they're not really saying, and community engagement if they don't know what's being proposed. The fact that the library and the Park and Rec never have yet to describe what they want to do there is really bizarre. And maybe that part should certainly be legislatively corrected.
Kush, I believe you have your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, I love this question. I think it's a great question in terms of like how legislation can be utilized. I think one, I wonder if there's a way for us, I was kind of hinting at it in my testimony, I wonder if there's a way for us to have certain pre-requirements of any sort of like work that we do. For example, if it is housing, then it does have a certain amount of affordability. It does have, I mean, we already have that with bedrooms, but it's like libraries or anything else where we have a certain amount. So if that's where the community decides to go, it's something that just cannot be negated. And I think you mentioned that it's like the strength of the community to like veto things. And I wonder if it's not strength. I think it's the question of which community members we're bringing in. And In Montgomery County, we're actively advocating for the legislative office to have a canvassing office where they are out knocking doors, talking with people all the day, and they could be contracted out. And I think if we're expecting people to come to a meeting at 7 p.m. where it's only English, where it's a presentation on a Tuesday, people who have that freedom, who tend to be white, rich homeowners, tend to be the ones that are there. But if we are able to really change the perspective on what attending and what supporting this kind of mission looks like, where we're out knocking on doors, where we're going to community events, where we're leaning on community organizations that's already doing that work, I think that type of legislating might be really useful. And I encouraged to see what's happening in Montgomery County.
I appreciate that. I am over time. Let me see if my colleague, Councilmember Matt Fruman, has questions for this panel.
Thank you very much. I'll have a few questions, and I think it was I too am going to have to leave in a little bit because I have another hearing. I think I may be able to make it through one more round of this hearing. Ms. Lenzner, you and I agree on a lot, but I do think I want to correct a couple of things because I think you described what you think happened in Chevy Chase and as if it were top down. And I really don't think that's accurate. The effort in Chevy Chase, which started a long time ago, you're right, 5 years ago, came from the ANC. The ANC created a task force on housing and racial justice. They had many hearings and engaged lots of different people. It went on for a while. They suggested that the Civic Corps might be a place where there could be housing. They urged Mary Cheh to put money into the budget so that there could be a small area plan. So it may be that there's lots of different opinions that are coming from the community today, but for an extended period of time, the elected representatives of Chevy Chase were the engines behind pursuing this agenda. They actually had to get the central city government to get behind it. So I don't think it's right that somebody somewhere in the Wilson building or in the developer circle had an idea and it was imposed. There can be different opinions today, but the history of it is actually a history of extended public engagement and then coming forward with it. Folks can say, well, some of it was during COVID, but they did what they could do in terms of reaching out to people and getting input. And it's way more of a grassroots initiative, or at least a community elected official based initiative than I think you give credit for being. That doesn't mean folks can't disagree today, but I think that's the history there. One of the things that Councilmember White went to in the last round, and I was going to ask the last panel, but maybe I'll ask it here, is I think there is a strong imperative to add affordable housing in the city, but I do think it may differ in different areas. I've been in communities in Ward 7 and 8 where folks have said, no, we don't want more affordable housing. We want market housing. And so I guess the question that I'd put to the panel is, and Ms. Lenzner, I'll let you start. When you get into a world of rigid requirements, they may or may not apply. They may or may not fit in every setting. Should the requirements of the shape of the housing differ from community to community, or should they apply uniformly all the way across the city?
I'm not exactly sure what you mean by the shape of the requirements. Are you talking about for affordable housing across the city in this amendment?
No, yeah. So in this legislation, there are requirements that a building of a certain size has to have this much of this kind of affordable housing, this much of that kind, these many 3-bedroom units. And that might, should that apply everywhere, or where there are different needs of affordable and market housing, should there be flexibility to do something different?
Well, I really can't speak to all the wards of the city and what the needs are. Certainly in Ward 3, where there is relatively little affordable housing other than rent control, which, as Andrea pointed out, needs to be considered. Certainly here, increasing those requirements is to our mind good. But I can well imagine that in other areas it might be different. But again, then the details are in the RFP, aren't they? I mean, or certainly in something quite specific to disposition, which the council has to approve.
No, I think that you're right about that. I agree with you. I think that the obligations in Ward 3 should be quite high. And so I share that view. I just wonder if it's the same in other places, and if it's in legislation, whether or not that leaves behind the flexibility to do what you need to do in someplace else. I don't know. Nick Deladon has his hand up. I don't know if that's about this or about just left up, but go ahead, Nick.
Well, no, it's related somewhat. I think there's a distinction to be made between the surplusing of property, public property, which is a precious resource, and to turn it over to a developer who makes a fortune on it and produces luxury units that remain vacant because we have a glut of luxury housing. And oppose that with this other notion that it is imponderable that the city would need affordable housing and make some kind of contract with a developer and not get the affordable housing that they are seeking. I mean, what is missing in that equation? We have resources, and so we get the housing that nobody can afford to live in. Why can't we get the housing that we require? Shouldn't that be part of the deal? I don't understand why it's such a big problem. And there are two separate issues. Surplusing public land is odious. There ought to be some kind of rule against almost never doing that. And we don't need to do it in order to get affordable housing. If we need affordable housing, there ought to be a way to get the affordable housing that we need. It shouldn't be all that difficult.
All right, thank you very much. I think Kush Rod also has his hand up. But I certainly agree that where there's been an obligation to deliver affordable housing, it has to be done, and we need to enforce that. But Kush Karad, if you have your hand up.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I agree that there's different areas that need different supports and different amounts of affordability. But I also think that affordability is something that all communities need regardless, right? Like, it is something that we all need. And I guess the question is how much are we deciding what the affordability rates are based off of like the vibes and the energy, or based off of data? Like, if the majority of people there need 40 to 50% AMI housing, then we should do 40 to 50% AMI. If the majority of folks there need 0 to 30%, that's something that we should be encouraging. Because I feel like there could be a lower threshold for this entire program that doesn't impede on like community like involvement and engagement. Like, I think if folks want housing, you can make an argument and give the data where it's like, okay, look, the majority of people here need 30% AMI, therefore we should really prioritize that. And with like good facilitation, good discussion, I feel like it's something that could definitely be part of the discussion. Do you agree or no?
No, I think that's super helpful. I mean, I do. I think that I worry about the need for we may have a need for more flexibility than, but I also don't want to open the door to then minimizing affordability. So I think it's tricky, and I'm not trying to express a very strong opinion on it, but it was one of the ideas that I wanted to explore. But I'm well out of time, but I will, one thing that I'll say again, Ms. Lenzner, really, you guys have talked about the need to purchase properties in Ward 3 in order to get housing done, and I definitely agree with that. You referenced something that I said about the biggest opportunity in Ward 3 is Friendship Heights, and I said that I think probably in the fall. It's a challenge, Friendship Heights, because of the financial problems that WMATA has, and so it's going to take a while. Hopefully these things will get solved pretty quickly, but I think it's going to take a while. I will say that since then, I think perhaps an even bigger opportunity has arisen with the Department of Homeland Security site.
Yeah.
Because the city can take control of the Department of Homeland Security site. That could be, in effect, our Reservation 13, scale like that. That also is going to take a while. And so I don't think you wait until those ships arrive, but I do think amend my comments from October to add the Department of Homeland Security site. And thank you very much.
Can I just say two quick things? There's no question, I agree with you, I'm sure, that the ANC did start this whole idea about what to do with the Chevy Chase Civic Corps. But the fact that the controversy is so intense right now demonstrates that it didn't work. And going back to how you get public engaged with some real idea of what's being contemplated, the ANC never talked about the deed restriction or the surplus. I mean, that never came up. So, and what exactly the agencies need on that site was never mentioned. So that wasn't what they were doing. Anyway, bottom line is it didn't produce the result that everybody wanted, which was some kind of community consensus about what's going to happen on that site. That's all. Thank you.
We can agree there is not a community consensus on what will happen on that site at this point, but thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councilmember Fruman, and thank you to this panel. That is it for our public witnesses. We're now going to move to our government witness and welcome Tawana Hicks, Associate Director of the Department of General Services portfolio.
Councilmember White, I hate to do this, but Andrea Rosen has her hand up, and I'm not sure she's going to have things deeply supportive of where I'm coming from, but I don't want her to walk away feeling like she was cut off. So if she,
I respect you, Councilmember Fruman.
I appreciate that. Thank you. I just wanted to say that when the ANC took the important step of actually sending postcards to every household in the ANC to fill out a survey, the participation was nearly 20%. 2,297 people in the ANC filled out the survey, and it was approximately 60 versus 37 or 40% overall opposition to housing as an additional use there, and a slightly larger percent against surplusing. And that was true for pretty much all of the SMDs, and even for the different demographics, which I have started to analyze. My point being, it wasn't just a matter of who was wealthy enough or old enough or white enough to show up for the public surplus meeting. I think going door to door is definitely the way to do it. They do that in Alexandria, Virginia, when they have major changes that they the planning department wants to implement. Anyway, I just think the ANC does not actually represent, its votes do not actually represent the community. I know that sounds odd, but most of them ran unopposed. They're just kind of have their own opinions, and that's how they go. So thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for bringing that to my attention, Councilmember Fruman. We now welcome DGS Associate Director for Portfolio Management, Tawana Hicks. I'm going to ask that you and anyone else who may be answering questions to stand so I can swear you in. You swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to provide to the Committee on Family Services Committee on Facilities and Family Services is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thanks so much. You can proceed with your testimony.
Good afternoon, Councilmember Lewis George. Well, she departed, but members of the Committee on Facilities and Family Services and members of the public. I am Tawana Hicks, Associate Director for the Department of General Services Portfolio Management Division. Joining me today is Javier Beltran, General Counsel. I'm here to present testimony regarding Bill B25-0039, the Common Ground Amendment Act of 2023. This legislation would make changes to the process the district follows to determine if real property is no longer required for public purposes and how the property is disposed of. Generally, DGS's role is not to make surplus determinations of district property, but rather we serve as one of the agencies that implements DC Official Code 10-801 when a surplus determination has been made by the executive. This law authorizes the mayor to dispose of district-owned real property that the council has determined is no longer needed for public use. Among the functions of DGS is to manage real property data. To that end, for all properties within our inventory, we track building characteristics and other property information, such as the square and lot, address, respective ANC, building square footage, and building use. We also conduct facility condition assessments to assess the current useful life and condition of various building systems and components such as roofing, plumbing, lighting, HVAC, and structural. We note that our client agencies make all decisions regarding the current and future use of properties within their inventory. These decisions are not driven by DGS. For example, the Department of Parks and Recreation makes decisions regarding the current and future use of recreation centers. Similarly, the Deputy Mayor for Education makes decisions relating to the current and future use of public school buildings. DGS's role with respect to client agency use of properties is limited to that of an implementation and support function. When a client such as DME makes a surplus determination of real property and seeks to dispose of such property, DGS is tasked with taking the steps outlined in the law, including the introduction of surplus and disposition resolutions for the council's consideration, as well as the final disposition of the property. Typically, a DGS disposition is for the use of a property as a charter school or other public benefit type of use. In the past 5 years, DGS has led efforts on one surplus disposition under DC Official Code 10-801. In 2019, at the request of DME, the district reactivated the site of the former Farabee Hope School through a lease to KIPP DC. This lease has resulted in the development by KIPP DC of a new DPR recreation center and associated outdoor spaces. We stand ready to work with our client agencies if the executive seeks to surplus and dispose of property under DC Official Code 10-801. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss this measure. We're happy to answer any questions you may have at this time.
Thank you very much. Good to see you, Associate Director Hicks. Used to see you more under my previous chairmanship, and Javier Beltran. Good to see you as well. When I was a young Hill staffer, long enough ago that I had hair on my head and not on my face, we used to work together extensively. So very good to see you as well. I appreciate your testimony and being with us today. Can you describe DGS's process for keeping track of what real property assets our government owns and how we're using them?
Well, we have an inventory that we've maintained. It's in a database, and it tracks all the property characteristics I mentioned before.
We work closely with our client agencies to track when the use of space has changed, or they may have needs beyond their existing space. And we track that all within Archivist. That's our system of record.
Does the public, and then separately, do district agencies have access to that database?
Some district agencies do have access. We work closely with OCFO because they need to understand how some of the properties are being used. I do not believe, we do not have public access to that database.
Is there a reason why the public wouldn't have access to it?
Not that I'm aware of.
What's the protocol for when one of your sibling agencies wants to explore using a vacant parcel for their uses?
Typically, it's a meeting between the client agency and my division, and we discuss what their desires are. We will have a sense if there are any other competing needs for that particular parcel or vacant lot, and share those with the agency if that's the case, and ultimately come to some decision with guidance from the executive.
One of the panelists, I think on the first panel, mentioned that there are some district-wide needs that we have to find space for. Some of these don't typically come to mind to the average person, like in archives, but there are other things like rec centers and libraries. Many communities feel like they don't have some government resources like rec centers and libraries close enough to their neighborhoods. Does DC government periodically map out various services to say, hey, we don't have a library here or shelter space there?
That is not DGS's role, so I don't want to speak for the district as a whole, but with respect to DGS, that is not a function that we do. We're not in that planning phase per se. We know where things are. We certainly know where they're located. But in terms of an overview, master planning, we would defer to the client agencies for that level of information.
So one of the major issues we're trying to address with this legislation is what we've seen, particularly when I chaired the committee with jurisdiction on this issue. There would be parcels or buildings that would be unutilized, government owned, that would be utilized, unutilized for many years. And then all of a sudden there's a quick moving development project, and community members are saying, hey, we didn't know this was coming. We didn't have an opportunity for input. Sometimes the mayor would ask that the council waive the laws, the notice or meeting laws. Sometimes meetings were held that the law requires, but years ago in a very different time and when the neighborhood was very different. And so people are feeling caught off guard and feeling like they didn't have a say in what was going to be developed in their neighborhood. If not by the vehicles that we try to create in this bill, what is a way that we could make sure we are understanding and responding to specific community needs? Not that they would have a veto necessarily, but that people who live in the neighborhood where development is going to happen would have a real say in what that development might be.
I think that DGS, with the projects that we commandeer on behalf of client agencies, we try to be very transparent, and we try to hold a number of public meetings with the affected communities. We give notices to the ANCs when we're entering into long-term leases or when we're purchasing property or disposing of it. So our goal is always transparency. We don't think it's a bad thing to add additional transparency to the process because, again, these are public lands and the community deserves input.
So in the vein of transparency, wouldn't it make sense that we make the underutilized properties publicly available so people can start to think about what their uses might be?
That is certainly, that makes sense.
I'll try to work with you all in the committee on that.
Mhm.
An experience I have is, I would say, no less than 2 times a month, sometimes a lot more than that. People come to me and say, "Hey, I run an organization, but we need space.
Mhm.
I want to talk to you about utilizing district-owned space."
Mhm.
And I have to give them the bad news that, one, there's a line of 1,000 people just at my door for that same use, but two, I don't even know which buildings or parcels are underutilized, but there are a lot of people doing really good work in our city. We do have quite a number. I think the number would surprise a lot of people, because not all of the buildings that we don't utilize or that we own and don't utilize are big.
Mhm.
But it seems like we are missing opportunities to utilize underutilized properties and parcels. Would you be open to working with the committee and with my office to see if there's a way to make a database public and to have a way of engaging members of the public who are interested in utilizing underutilized space, so that they could understand what that process might look like?
Yes, we would certainly be open to working with the committee.
I'd appreciate that.
Mhm.
Section 104 of my bill would make it so that before the public gets called in to comment on a proposed property surplus action, the executive has to prepare at least a map of nearby amenities to help the public assess the situation. That is, proximity from the government-owned site in question to libraries, rec center, grocery store. What do you think of that idea, to make sure the community has a foundation of knowledge as they sort of develop an idea of what they might want to see in their neighborhood on public land?
I think these are all helpful data points for any community member that would like to weigh in on these types of decisions.
Who leads the meetings that are currently required under law for surplus and disposition? Which agency leads those meetings?
It's typically the client agency. We're there to support because, again, we are the mechanism by which the action takes place, but the client agencies are typically leading those meetings.
So if it was a school that had been vacant for 5-10 years,
DME would be present.
Yeah, okay,
Mhm.
okay. Why is that as opposed to DGS?
Because again, we are not the ones that dictate the use of the space. Those decisions and determinations are made by the client agencies.
I have to think more about that, because the buildings don't belong to them. They're public buildings within the public portfolio. They're utilizing them. And do the client agencies have more say than other agencies on what the future use would be?
I don't know that it's more, but they have certainly the initial say.
All right.
Yes.
So as the landlord for public buildings, once an agency vacates, shouldn't that put it just squarely in DGS's portfolio?
Once it's vacant, it is within our portfolio, but our goal is always to backfill with another agency. I mean, we are always in need of space. So it's not ideal for a building that is in operation and fully functional. Our goal is to keep that occupancy level high. Now, when you're talking about completely vacant properties, yes, it falls within DGS's portfolio, primarily to maintain and secure. But in terms of decisions for the future use of that property, again, we would defer to our client agencies.
Okay. That seems to be an inefficient way of operating. I'm sure it may be that way for a reason that I don't yet understand, and so I want to.
Are you adding more to our plate?
I want the process to make sense. I just don't think that other client agencies are not the real estate arm of the city.
Mhm.
And I don't know, once they vacate a property, I don't know why they would have any say over the future use of that property. Nor do I think they are particularly good at engaging communities. And we've seen some of that break down, like around Banneker some years ago. Education agency, they just are not experts at sort of community engagement around real estate. So I need to do some work to understand why things are this way. If I can't find a reason, then I'm coming back to you all to say, hey, we need to change this.
Understood.
I lost track of where I was in my questions. Oh, is Councilmember Fruman still with us? Councilmember Fruman, I apologize. Do you have questions?
I'll just have a couple of questions, and that'll give you a second to refine your bearings. So thank you very much for your testimony. Ultimately, so the surplus decision, is the surplus decision made by your agency, or is it made by a different agency?
It's not made by DGS, it's made by our client agencies.
And so, and then the disposition issues are not things that you have to deal with. So, I mean, in a certain sense, I wish we had other government agencies here that are playing a role in this process, because a lot of this controversy has been about not just the taking of the inventory, but the decisions about surplus, and then the decisions about disposition. And I hope that we can inject in that the decisions about the RFP process. I'm curious, as you do inventories of the properties, the one that is very active for me right now is the Chevy Chase Library and Rec Center. And it doesn't quite fit into the conversation that you and Chairman White were having, in that the agencies are not going to vacate the site. The agencies are going to build new facilities on the site. The thing that is being determined to be surplus is the air rights. And how do you do anything to take into account air rights over public buildings, how much capacity there is to build on top of public buildings, and an inventory of that, and how much of that might be available, or how do air rights fit into the work that you're doing?
Air rights generally do not fit into the work of DGS. That's more of a DEMPED calculation function, not DGS.
Right. So, I mean, and as we look around the city, I mean, there's one thing, there's the vacant parcels, there's the property owned by the city that isn't being used. But and I think it's probably in a couple of different places. There's the Chevy Chase Civic Corps. There's probably also the property on Florida Avenue, where the police and fire station are located. And then the discussion, it's not that there wouldn't be a police and fire station, it's what might be done with the air rights. But that's not a thing that's cataloged in any way that you're aware of.
No, it's not.
All right. Well, thinking about that, because I do think that's where a lot of the conversation, in some places it's a different conversation, but I think that's where a lot of the conversation is going to migrate. And so how do we deal with air rights in this rubric, I think, is important. I'm going to take I have a question about management of buildings. Is it your office or division that, for example, manages the rental of buildings for after school use and things like that, or is that a different part of DGS that does that?
That does fall under my purview.
And there's new rules about when say a field is rented, then the funds go into one place and then they eventually get distributed to a portion of them can be distributed to the schools. Are you managing that process, or how is that process managed?
We, that process is a dual process in conjunction, largely with DCPS. But it is part of the function of the Portfolio Management Division.
And has it been happening? Have payments been being made to schools? I think it's 20% of the rental fees go back to the schools. Is that happening?
We certainly do collect fees. I would have to get back to you on the breakdown. Those fees cover security costs, they cover janitorial. But we can get back to you on specifics.
So I'm sorry, so the fees, okay, I think this isn't fair to you in this context. It just happened that you were in front of me, and this has been an area that I've been interested in. So I think I need to focus on how to get at this through the oversight process. And maybe the thing is to try to include questions in the oversight process where you can spell out how much money has come in from each of the different sites and how those funds have been distributed. But this isn't the place for that. I'll pick that up a different time. With that, thank you very much for your testimony, and I will turn it back to Chairman White.
Thank you, Councilmember Fruman. Does DGS get requests from the Interagency Council on Homelessness for lists of vacant buildings that could be used as transitional housing or permanent housing?
I believe we have, but we could follow up and confirm.
Okay, I appreciate it. You can follow up with the committee. The bill, so this bill would also separate the surplus and disposition processes so that we don't get too far along developing a specific non-governmental use before we really evaluate potential public uses. Set up a new ombudsperson. The bill requires the executive to release written responses to the questions that come up in administrative hearings, and encourages community benefit agreements. Also calls on the Office of Racial Equity to provide thoughts. Is there anything else that you would recommend to make sure we get the most meaningful public input without unduly stalling new land uses?
I am not prepared to respond to that question right now. The bill is certainly thoughtful, and there are a number of interesting ideas. But I think this is something we could potentially provide to you subsequent to this hearing.
Okay, I will find out when the record for the hearing closes momentarily, and we'll make sure the 21st, a week from today. One of the other things we're trying to get at in this bill that most people feel like we don't have enough of, and I agree in the city, which is housing for larger household. The DC government procured a study a few years ago. This was done jointly by the Urban Institute and the Coalition for Nonprofit Housing and Economic Development. For anyone who wants to look for it, it's called an assessment of the need for large units in the District of Columbia. This is from June of 2019. That study showed we would need a lot more affordable housing units with 3 or more bedrooms to be able to prevent displacement of families from DC. Can you talk about what our government is doing to make sure there are enough of those units getting built and preserved?
I am not well positioned to speak on that subject. I would defer to my colleagues at DEMPED.
Okay. So I will say the mayor determines who to send to the hearing, and they know the subject matter and the gist of the question. So we will be on the lookout until the 21st for a response on that. Is there, last question on this, is there any good reason not to push developers to include more 3-bedroom units in their affordable housing proposals?
I think, again, with that question, I would defer to the subject matter experts, which are my colleagues at DEMPED.
What role does DGS play in the disposition process?
I believe we're the mechanism by which, because we're enabled through our statute to dispose of properties. So we work with the client agencies to see these surplus and dispositions through. As I made mention in my testimony, the dispositions we have actively engaged in are centered around, or have been centered around, public schools, vacant public schools. And typically those have been disposed of via long-term ground leases to charter schools.
But those aren't the exclusive dispositions that we've done, even since I've been on the council. Has DGS not played a role in non-school property dispositions?
There may have been a couple of, I feel like there was one that involved maybe an alley lot of some sort, but the details of which I would have to provide to you.
Okay. So if the client agency determines whether a property is no longer needed for a public use and DMPED determines the future use, I'm having trouble figuring out what role DGS plays.
I think they're two different disposition
Sure.
processes.
Sorry, DMPED would then do the disposition process. Though, residential is in the DMPED portfolio. We're more municipal uses. So, affordable housing, all of that would be in the DMPED portfolio, and they would do the whole 10801 process.
All right. So, but if a government-owned property is no longer used by an agency and they say, okay, we have no future use for it,
Mm-hmm.
what's the next step?
In some cases, that particular property would be identified by DMPED for larger development, in which case it goes into their portfolio for the surplus determination and disposition.
And so if that property is in a community that doesn't have a rec center, when do their needs get considered in this process?
In 10801, as it stands now, at the community hearing that we have for both surplus and disposition,
In
the two hearings.
Okay, and who runs those hearings?
Those would be the client agencies. In the case we spoke about, that would be DMPED.
All right. So we would need to rely on DMPED. We rely on DMPED to sort of put a flag and say, hey, before we go too far down this development process, we should think about whether we need a rec center here.
This is the process that's in place now.
Okay. And DMPED, to my knowledge, does not keep what I was asking about earlier, which is sort of a map of uses to determine where there are gaps.
I'm not aware.
Okay. I'm concerned about our process. I think we're missing things. I mean, this comes back to sort of the reason that we wrote this bill, because there are gaps in our planning process that cut out community input and I think miss opportunities. But I also think we rely too much on client agencies that just don't have an interest here. The DCPS is not particularly doesn't have much reason to be concerned about sitting on vacant buildings. And somebody has to be concerned about that, which is why I think property should automatically revert to DGS once they're no longer utilized in a material way by the agency. But we will work on that as this bill moves forward. Those are all the questions that I have. I want to thank you both again for being with us today. Councilmember Fruman, do you have more questions? My apologies.
No, thank you very much. I left time on the table last time, so I am done. I want to thank the witness for her testimony and thank you to all the witnesses today.
Thank you. As I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, the record for this hearing will close on December 21st. That's a week from today. If there are folks who were not able to testify but would like to submit testimony for the record, you can send a written copy of your testimony to facilities@dccouncil.gov so that it can be included in the record. Hearing record closes at 5 p.m. on Thursday, December 21st. With that, the business before the committee is concluded and this hearing is adjourned.